Well, good morning, Biology 20s. I wanted to do a bit of review of urine formation before we start on with osmoregulation. So I've just added this little bit to your notes guide. Your notes guide doesn't have this little chart because you already know it, right? You already know the parts of the nephron. You already know the major events in urine formation. So this is just a little rehash of what we already know in order that we can move on and start talking about this osmoregulation business. Okay, so let's do this. Let's label the parts of the nephron. Now, I've gotten in labeled in red here. They're not actually the nephron, but it's the blood supply to and around the nephron. The parts in blue are the actual parts of the nephron, the kidney tubule itself. Okay, so you should know where all these parts are. Let's go and label them. Okay, so incoming blood, afferent arterial, glomerulus is the capillary under high pressure because this is the only spot in your whole body where it goes arterial, capillary, arterial. Normally that's a venule. So this is making a high pressure in order for filtration to occur. We'll talk about those events in urine formation in just a second. So now getting right into the actual parts of the nephron, we've got the Bowman's capsule, then the proximal tubule or proximal convoluted tubule, then the loop of Henle, the descending limb goes down, the ascending limb goes up, then the far away, the distal convoluted tubule or distal tubule, and then a whole bunch of distal tubules dump into the collecting duct. Now, for the sake of simplicity, I don't have the tubular capillary, but you have to understand that from the efferent arteriole here, the tubular capillary is going to go all the way across the nephron, and of course, that's going to facilitate reabsorption and secretion. Okay, so you should all be able to label the parts of the nephron. And now let's talk about the major events. Where is filtration, reabsorption, and secretion occurring in the kidney, the nephron? Okay, so here's our events: filtration, reabsorption, secretion. So filtration happens only if the particles are small enough to fit through the pores of the glomerulus and go into the Bowman's capsule. So if they are small enough, things like salt and water and amino acids, they're going to make through from the blood into the Bowman's capsule. And if they're too large, things like red blood cells, platelets, okay, all these too large of things to fit through the filter, to fit through the pores in the glomerulus, they don't get filtered. They're not the filtrate. They're not going to make it into the urine. And then the reabsorption, well, remember we said here that we've got this tubular capillary all the way around here. Well, reabsorption is referring to when particles are moving from the kidney tubule into the bloodstream. And so right away, almost like I think it's 60 or 70% of the things that got filtered are reabsorbed and they're going right back into the bloodstream. So things that the body needs, like amino acids and glucose, like you should never have glucose in your urine, right? Same with amino acids because they're getting reabsorbed. So there's also reabsorption occurring in the loop of Henle. And in the loop of Henle, it's all about reabsorption of either salt or water. So certain parts are permeable to salt, but not to water. And there's still reabsorption going on in the distal tubule as well. So things that are in high concentration in the distal tubule will make their way out of the distal tubule and into the blood. Now, what then is secretion? Well, it's the opposite process of reabsorption, where something is in a high concentration in the blood in this tubular capillary, and it's going to go into the kidney tubule. And that's going to happen here in the distal tubule. Okay, once we've reached the collecting duct, there's very little reabsorption or secretion happening. And of course, by this point in time, the product that we're making and what the final thing is urine. Okay, and so at that point in time, it will then go into the renal pelvis and into the ureters, stored in the bladder, out the urethra, and into your toilet. Okay, so that's just a quick review for us of the different parts of the nephron and the events in urine formation. So the new material we're talking about today is all about osmoregulation, and it just has to do with regulating salts, so sodium chloride is salt. So that means sodium ions and chloride ions. These are particles or electrolytes or solutes, they're particles. And also the regulation of water. So the reason why it's called osmoregulation is because water moves, it diffuses, it's passive transport from high to low concentration. And that process is called osmosis. So we get the word osmoregulation to refer to water concentrations and also salt concentrations. And so our body has two hormones that are used to regulate salt balance and water balance. And they both act here on the distal tubule and on the collecting duct. So when you need to reabsorb more water or to conserve water, you release the hormone ADH. And when you need to reabsorb more salt, when you don't have enough salts or solutes, then you send out the hormone aldosterone. And again, they both act on the distal tubule and also the collecting duct to alter the final concentration of urine. So that's where we're going. This booklet is talking about how do we regulate water versus salt. So when we talk about osmoregulation, we actually have cells in our brain, in a special part of the brain, called the hypothalamus, that is going to determine if our blood has got too many particles, too many solutes, so you're dehydrated. In other words, there's too many salt particles, ions, too much sodium, too much chloride. You're dehydrated. You're not drinking enough water. So there's less water and more particles. And so if that's the case, then it sends a message to this little gland that just hangs right off it called the pituitary gland. So you can see here's in your brain, the pituitary is just this little gland, tiny, probably about like the size of your pinky fingernail or so. And it is just going to release this hormone ADH, the anti-diuretic hormone, or the anti-P hormone. And so when water then gets reabsorbed, it moves from the kidney tubule, the distal tubule or the collecting duct, and goes back into the bloodstream, back into our tubular capillaries, and that's going to offset the too high of salts, the particles, the solutes, and that puts your body back into balance. Okay, so here's an example. Here's my stylized little version of the nephron. Here's the tubular capillary. And you can see that there's lots of salt in your bloodstream, right? You are got too much salt, too high of solute concentration, you're dehydrated. So the hormone ADH is going to be released. It's going to be released into the bloodstream, and it's going to travel through your blood, and it's going to go into your kidneys, and then it's going to act here on the distal tubule and the collecting duct. And what's it going to do? Well, it's going to cause you to conserve water. Well, that's just another word for saying that the tubules become more permeable to water. So water is going to move out. It's not going to end up in the urine anymore. It's going to go back into your bloodstream to balance out the extra concentration of the sodium and the chloride and all these extra solutes. So now with the water moving in, there's less water in your urine. And because there's less water in your urine, that means that your urine is going to be kind of more yellowy in color, more concentrated, and well, there's less water in it, right? And so the concentration of all the other solutes will be high, but there's less water in urine. Okay, so ADH is for water conservation. All right. Now, what happens with if you drink too much water or substances that are called diuretics? So caffeine is an example of a diuretic. Coffee, tea, even alcohol is a diuretic. It's actually going to do the opposite. It's going to shut off the ADH. So now you're not sending it out from the pituitary. It's not traveling through the blood. It's not going to end up in your kidney nephron. And therefore, you're not reabsorbing water into the blood. And so you've already got lots of water in the bloodstream, right? There's the water in the bloodstream already in that tubular capillary. So ADH is not being sent out. So you're not reabsorbing water. You don't want to, right? You already have lots of water in there. And so as a result, your blood sorry, not your blood, your urine is going to be more dilute. So there's more water in your urine. And of course, we all know what that looks like. When there's more water in your urine, it's more clear. Okay, so it looks less yellow. It's watery, right? It's almost colorless. And there's a higher concentration of water in the urine. Okay. All right, so those are diuretics, and they inhibit or stop the action of ADH, the antidiuretic hormone. So this little diagram just shows the two scenarios I talked about. If you drank too much water, like too much coffee, or you had diuretic, or you drank a wobbly pop, that's booze, or the opposite, being too many solutes and you're dehydrated, what happens with the release of ADH? Is it shut off or is it turned on? And so you can read through that in order to do the questions in this booklet. And then it talks about some diseases here. It talks about, well, actually just one disease. It talks about diabetes insipidus. So you've heard the word diabetes before. We've talked about it before already. Diabetes, that word just means a disease with excessive urination and thirst. So here's where the problem is. A lot of students get confused because there's actually different types of diabetes. So the one we're talking about here is diabetes insipidus. It means tasteless diabetes. Why is it tasteless? Because there's no ADH. The problem with this type of diabetes is, yes, you have excessive urination and you're very thirsty and you're peeing huge volumes of this tasteless, clear water urine, like 20 liters a day. 2 liters is normal. It's like 10 times the amount of this really watery urine, because you do not have ADH being produced by the pituitary. The more common diabetes that you are familiar with, and we've talked about this one already, and this is not the type of diabetes we're talking about here. This one, diabetes mellitus, or sugar diabetes, has to do with not having insulin produced from the pancreas. Insulin is a hormone that regulates your blood sugar levels. And trust me, we'll talk a lot more about this in Biology 30. So the deal is, you will pee higher volumes of sweet, sugary urine. And now you're probably wondering, what is Mrs. Ledeen talking about? What does she mean, tasteless urine? This is going to gross you out, but this is actually how a lot of, well, years and years ago, before the technology came about, how you could distinguish between the two types of urine. And you've got it, you taste the urine. So if you don't have ADH and you're peeing large volumes of clear urine, it's just like water. On the other hand, if you have diabetes mellitus, your urine is going to have sugar in it. And remember, we talked about sugar should not be in your urine. There should be no glucose because it needs to be reabsorbed right away back into the proximal tubule. So if you have sugar in your urine, it's going to be sweet. So before they developed easy little dip sticks or little devices or meters or whatever to test and find out if there's sugar or water in it, they had to taste it. Okay, and so that's how they could find out the two different types of diabetes: insipidus, tasteless, because of no ADH, just watery, versus diabetes because it's sugar balance being affected because there's no insulin. Okay, this is the end of video 1 here, and then video 2 I'm going to talk about salt balance and aldosterone.